This is a Step Beyond the Fire podcast. My name is Cully Lord. I'm a land manager and a wildlife biologist here in my home state of Florida. I invite you to join me on a journey as I seek to document the little-known stories told by those who use fire for the benefit of the land, also known as prescribed fire. So come on, let's head into the field and meet the people where the flame ends and new life begins. Welcome back to a Step Beyond the Fire podcast. I am your host, Cully Lord, and we have an exciting guest here with us on this episode. We have Tracey Sleek, a land manager for the University of Florida Ordway Swisher Biological Station, which is a property that was acquired for research and educational purposes near the city of Melrose, Florida. The area has greatly benefited recently from Tracey's leadership and her management efforts. And I've invited Tracey to join me here today. We're sitting next to the campfire, having a campfire conversation, really looking forward to that. And she and I have worked together here in North Central Florida. And I want to point out that I like to send my crew members to go work with Tracey because she's got excellent experience in leadership and yeah, she's a great teacher. So welcome, Tracey.
Yeah, thank you, Cully. I appreciate you having me.
So what I wanted to get into first is if you can tell us a little bit about yourself and your path in life and how that got you involved with fire. I know that's kind of a loaded question, but...
Well, really kind of what really got me into fire, I'd have to say, is good mentors, that really sealed the deal for me. And that's, it takes a lot of passion on the individual's end like for me, I had to love what I was doing and love prescribed fire. But really sealed the deal was being around people who not only loved it, but could also teach and pass on their passion and knowledge. And that's been really beneficial to me. And I have a couple individuals in North Florida that have just really helped build me up into a better person and a better fire practitioner and a land manager, ultimately.
Mentorship is something it's so critical.
Yeah.
Every step of the way, whether you have just gotten out of your basic S-130-190, basic introduction to wildland firefighting, all the way until you become a fire management officer and you're in charge of an entire ranger district or higher than that, Every step along the way, I can remember mentors that really helped me think about fire in different ways. And it sounds like that's what you've experienced too.
Yeah. And so my first fire mentor that really kind of, put me on the path of lifelong learning in this and realizing that you're going to be learning your whole career is, she was a biologist at a local park here in Gainesville. And, she just, there's a whole generation of prescribed fire practitioners that came up under her in this region. And the leadership, the knowledge, the competency, all of that was there. And I think all of us as a group can really point to this individual and say, this is really kind of what shaped our early career and put us on a path. Because a couple of us have come up in fire now, and it really is it takes that little extra push, I think, in the beginning to help get you there.
Do you mind if I ask who that is?
Yeah, so I hope she doesn't mind this, but Andy Chrisman and
yeah. Awesome.
So, and there's
great.
There's been like I said, a couple of us that regionally that and you call her up and she'll answer the phone and answer any questions you have, because she's been doing this for over 20 years, and just kind of understanding her breadth of experience and how she's come up, and is really impressive.
That is impressive. Yeah, I can remember several individuals that really impacted me in ways like what you're talking about, and yeah, it really helped it also sort of grounded me. It got me. It didn't put me in my place, but it helped me keep a level head. Because it's easy in this type of work to, if you have a bunch of successes or you do really well here, there, and on these different scenarios, you can easily fall into the ego trap and get overly confident. So there's been some of that too, and I like that usually the individuals who have been doing this for so long, you get to a point in your career, and that's where they were in their careers, that they realize that giving back is just as valuable
Yeah.
as actually getting in the field and doing the burning and all those kinds of things, and having that instruction ability. I was involved with, when I spent with my time with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission, I got invited to participate in the mentorship development process for the whole entire agency, which I was a little nervous. I said, oh man, what do I know about mentorship? I'm just a young individual, and I helped out where I could and helped frame some of that in a way that was that you could put things down on paper and pair mentors together with individuals and formalize it in a process. And I think that's what I really liked about it, is the ability to influence individuals, whether I'm just doing a small piece of an administrative puzzle or whether it's being on the ground and saying, no, you need to stop what you're doing and do this, or those kind of things.
Well, just one more thing, and it wasn't just like Andy who really like kind of put me on the path, who really kind of sealed the deal for me to stay in like fire leadership and keep developing, was a park manager I worked under, Kevin Patton, and he would just throw things at me and say, Tracey, you'll do just fine. And it worked out. And so he threw you into the fire on a lot of things, and he was always there. And I don't mean that negatively. I mean that in that
metaphorically.
Yeah. And you just, some things you got to learn by doing, and that's, prescribed fire is one of those things you cannot learn by a book. You can't learn by taking a class. It's almost like an apprenticeship in a sense, and I'd like to think that I view that as I was Kevin's apprentice, and he had been doing fire at that point for 25, 30 years. And so just, hey, Kevin, what do you think about this? And he said, well, do it and find out, it'll be just fine. And so, just knowing that you have someone in your corner, not just top cover, but also just there to support you and provide that knowledge base is super important.
Far out. So speaking of the Florida Park Service, I stumbled across an interesting story over the last week. I was doing this research for a PowerPoint, and I found way back in 1971, the very first prescribed burn ever took place for the Florida Park Service. And what I realized in that process is that during that time, there was a stigma against prescribed burning. And I believe that goes all the way back to what happened with the big blow up of 1910, that major wildfire that created a lot of fear throughout the nation, moreover, and that began the long period of fire suppression that happened throughout the country. And it went all the way up until the Smokey the Bear thing. Only you can prevent forest fires. That went on for 50 years. And so fast forward to 1971, Falling Water State Park up near Tallahassee, there was two landowners that lived nearby. The names were Ed and Betty Komarek. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but they used prescribed fire, and they understood why it was important. They used it on their property. And they reached out to Jim Stevenson, who is a very well-known naturalist, had a lot of great influence on Florida conservation efforts for many, many years, But there's even an award that's given out every year. The Jim Stevenson Award is a very coveted land manager award. What a neat project it was, because the private landowners, they were friends with Jim, and they got together, and at that time Park Service was managing about 211,000 acres, so it was still in its infancy. But they convinced him, and he took that and went to Tallahassee and said, hey, I want to do this. We can do this. And what I thought was neat is that they started small, they started smart, they started simple, and did a small prescribed burn. And there's a photograph of it on their website. This is all public knowledge, but of what that burn looked like. But I thought it was so neat that they started what now is a nationally known burn program that has reached accumulatively over the 2 million acre mark now. In 2021, I think that they surpassed 2 million acres, 175 state parks. Big program, a lot of great influence. And I know you got your start with Florida Park Service, correct?
I did, yep.
And I did too. I started out as a part-time park ranger working at Dunn's Creek State Park in Pomona Park, Florida. So at any rate, this major program, and the best part of all of this, the crew boss on this burn was, the crew boss is sort of the on-the-ground person directing the individuals on a given team. You oftentimes when you burn, you split up into teams and you go different directions and you use different firing techniques. But when the burn boss is the one who's in charge of the whole thing, but those crew bosses really make a lot of decisions during the day too. But the first crew boss was a female, Betty Comarak. And I thought that was so great, because there was a thing in the article that says, well, it was a lot for those longtime employees who had never used fire, never used it once. It was a big ask. And then the female, some individual that they never met before was leading them through this process. So I thought that was the best part of that story for me, is that during those times, stigmas was a little bit different. They might not have liked taking orders from a woman, and that's what it mentioned in the article. So, but along those lines, I wanted to take a minute to kind of dive into, as a female coming through this mentorship process and working in prescribed fire for a long time, what were there any major challenges that you had to overcome early on?
I really want to. I want to give an honest answer to this, and I think I was very lucky. My first prescribed fire jobs were in and around Gainesville, which is a very accepting area of Florida, and then a lot of times with Florida Park Service, they're genuinely good people that work for that agency, and so I can't say I had any terrible challenges that I came across being a female in leadership, other than a lot of that was self-doubt, to be 100% honest. That's why it was super powerful to have a female mentor at the beginning, because I had this example of what's possible. This very confident, very proficient individual, and I had this example, which is great. And then moving from gaining the experience, stepping into the leadership under Kevin Patton as my leadership mentor, he didn't see any difference. He treated me no different than anyone else. And having him in my corner, it was a boost of confidence, because I could just walk into any situation and be like, this guy who's been doing it longer than any of the other people around here is like, she's good to go. Yeah. And so it was just, it's like any kind of new leader stepping into those positions. What it is the confidence built. It's either you get it beat into the ground because you need it beat into the ground,
Right.
or
Yeah.
you need to get built up into it.
Yeah.
And so that's that. Whether that's a female issue or a universal issue, I'm not sure, but
I had stumbled across that recently, and I got to thinking about that and how that, in a traditionally in wildland fire, it's a more of a male dominated profession. And maybe I'm not quite right about that these days. I think things have changed quite a bit, and I love that there's so much diversity on the line. And that's one of the reasons that I've got into this, is to have a diverse experience and working environment. So yeah, that was why I thought of that. I stumbled across that story this week.
yeah, and I think prescribed fire is just a very different environment from wildfire. I think
It is.
I think it attracts different personalities. I think it's a different, you have just a different tempo, a different feel to the whole thing, and
Yeah, and I had mentioned in the first episode that we don't use those terms interchangeably here. Wildfire and prescribed fire, two completely different things. And so, in order to get into a little bit of the technicalities, to try to paint a picture for the audience here about those 4 operational phases that I wanted to get into, and the first of which I think it's a good time to talk about that tonight. The first one, as you know, is planning and evaluation. So you and I both know that this is the phase that really determines the success or failure of all burning efforts in Florida. And that covers things like deciding how your burn unit's going to look, what your control lines are going to be, what type of weather you're going to use, the personnel, all of those important details, what kind of equipment you need. So my question for you is, what does this phase mean for you? And what have you learned from going through that planning and evaluation phase?
so to be honest, ignition is the fun part. It's
Right.
so, like, as a burn boss, it's the culmination of all of that preparation, all of that planning. So a burn, depending upon how many acres and the ecosystem and all that, it maybe a couple hours. You're looking at maybe a longer day, depending upon what you're doing. But I guarantee, as a burn boss, I've put a couple days of work into that, and definitely more. And just the planning process, and then the actual prep. You're going through and snagging those units, and I'm sure you've talked about this on other episodes, but so you're taking this, like, days and weeks and everything of just you in your head thinking about it, and then actively prepping, and then you get out after a briefing, which you've also prepared for, and then kind of build yourself, build it up in, and then you present this plan to your crew, and you of course offer them the opportunity to say, hey, this isn't safe, or hey, like, I've got these questions, and then you get out to your unit, and then you put fire on the ground. Like test fire. Okay, all these factors are coming together. The weather's great, or it isn't. Your crew, they've got their pumps running. They've got their tools out. They're doing all the things that you've put forth in that planning and that briefing and in that prep. And then that it's the execution portion of the burn, and it's so satisfying to see all those things, like the culmination of all of that as a burn boss, to see that.
Right. I've noticed, coming from a state agency where we had thousands of acres to manage and lots of directions that we could put smoke. Now, smoke management is one of those things that can be a big problem for people, for roads, for folks that may have medical issues, for air traffic control. Smoke can be devastating, and especially when mixed with fog and other types of inclement weather events. So coming from my previous experiences, burning on thousands of acres. We can send smoke 4 different directions. It doesn't matter so much. And now working for a city, my experiences with the planning process have, well, for one thing, it's increased exponentially. The number of planning days that go into our activities, because now fire in the urban interface is a very critical and necessary part of what we do. I mean, we burn for many reasons, and we burn for fuel reduction, we burn for wildlife, we burn for forest management practices, and the list goes on. So you have, suddenly when you introduce fire into those landscapes where there's people involved to a much higher degree, it makes it complicated. You got to pick. I'm saying this because I'm going through this right now. I've been looking at the weather forecast off and on, and we all do this as burners. We're always looking at the forecast between
Obsessively, yes.
November until August. So I've got this situation right now where there's a neighborhood involved, and we're going to be. That is a beer cracking open, by the way, listeners.
I don't know whose beer.
So we got this whole process. We have to have a certain number of days since it rained last. We have to have adequate fuel moisture. We don't want to kill old trees that have not seen fire in a very long period of time. We have to do the smoke management. We have to outreach, work with the communities, describe to them what we're doing, why we're doing. I've spent days and days and days doing all this for a small, 20-acre burn. Maybe, well, it's actually less than 20 acres. I lied, but maybe like 18.
Round up.
So, yeah, exactly. So the planning phase, that can vary widely. And I know at Ordway, your planning phase is much different than what I'm doing.
Yeah, yep.
Not that it's any better or any worse, but it's just a lot different.
You operate in a very urban environment. I'm very rural. I'm very lucky in that sense,
So we say those things that, there's this whole process of working through deciding what your burn unit is going to be, how that's going to look. Sometimes if you start working on a property, maybe there already is a burn unit. That's great. And there's already lines around it, that discontinuity of fuels around it. All you got to do is get a farm tractor out there and maintain it. But sometimes you don't have that luxury. Sometimes you have to go in and put lines in to make a stand, a natural area smaller, so you can burn small pieces at a time. And that's what I'm in the middle of doing right now, because we need fire so desperately in these areas in and around within the city limits. But we have to approach it in a small, systematic way, much like what your predecessors had done. Burn small, burn smart, burn simple. So that's what's going on in my life right now. And I'm sure you've experienced things like that numerous times as well.
Yeah, and, kind of going back to, the ignition portion of that, just thinking about, honestly, if this is a podcast about prescribed fire, a lot of times I try and get my ignition done before people get home from work. I try and put a little timeline on that. So then that way they get home from work, around 4 or 5 o'clock, and all they see is a little bit of smoke and then some black area maybe behind their house. And so they're not seeing that big show, that big finish potentially.
Coming up through the ranks, going from crew member to line boss to burn boss, can you recall any memorable experiences with that phase of the burn, the ignition and holding?
I had to shuffle through a couple experiences, and I think I've got a good one for you. So, this is probably, I was maybe 2 years into line bossing or crew bossing, depending upon what you call it regionally. And it was a primarily holding line boss in this instance, and the ignition was happening in pretty grassy fuels, and then we were blowing into other grassy fuels. And there was another line boss, and he was pretty confident, but didn't necessarily have the experience to back that confidence up. And he was actually a trainee on this burn,
which is an individual in going through the training process so they can achieve that designation.
Yeah, so
right.
he was basically on his, usually a lot of agencies or nonprofits, they'll do these trainee positions for maybe 2, 3, depending upon the individual, maybe more trainee burns, or maybe they want to go back to a trainee. You can, as an individual, can say, hey, I've said this before, I don't feel comfortable line bossing on this 10-year-old scrub line that I have no experience burning on,
Sure,
and it's but so in this instance, he had never line bossed in these fuels, in these conditions, and his trainer this day was someone who had been doing prescribed fire for 40 years. And he was like, he could make fire, just do whatever. It was impressive. He could just be like, all right, go put 2 points and a dash here, and he could just somehow draw fire off a line. It was so impressive. He just knew how fire behaved and how to play with ignition to get the responses that he wanted. And so in this instance, I think he recognized this individual as being very potentially, maybe a little overconfident. And it was the start of the day. We were putting in our black line, which is the initial, basically kind of you're building your black so you can continue with your interior ignition, which is kind of the theory, the central point of this episode. But so we're putting in the black line, and this line boss trainee says, all right, I'm gonna have someone go 20 foot in, and then, because it really wasn't going, it was early in the morning, I'm gonna have someone go 20 foot in and someone in, maybe 10 foot off them. And so, my eyes get wide, the burn boss's eyes get wide, and I look at his trainer, and he looks at me, and he just kind of shrugs and nods, and I'm like, all right. And then our burn boss for the day looks around and says, you all need to get your tools. And so in that moment, I was like, what is going on? And what it goes back to really is a really interesting way to mentor someone via ignition. And so it blew up, you're 20 feet in grassy fuels off the line. It ripped towards that line. But
so he put down too much.
He put down too much fire
in that process.
Yeah. And so
it's a fine line.
His eyes got all big. He started directing people, directing the equipment. And so in our actor-action review, a couple people were like, hey, what happened at the start of the day? Ultimately, the burn went fine. It stayed in the box. We met our objectives, and everyone was safe. Those 3 major factors. And so this goes back to that mentorship, in that he looked at everyone there, and he said, all of the people were there. All of the equipment was there. It was early enough in the day. And you got to learn sometime.
So he knew.
He knew what was going to happen.
He knew what was going to happen. He was going to scare the heck out of everybody. And he wanted to, so that's a great, that's a great way.
And so did
teaching.
And so did the burn boss. That's why they're like, get your tools. I want those pumps fired up. But it really, so what this taught me is allowing for a little bit of failure, but not catastrophic. So putting someone in a situation where they might be doing something wrong, but you in a leadership position, in a mentor position, and as a trainer, you recognizing, is someone going to get hurt? Is this gonna be really bad? And so once again, it goes back to his decision. He was looking around. This was at the start of the day. People, equipment, early in the day, and just made that decision to let someone fail and learn from those mistakes. And sometimes prescribed fire allows you to be able to do that, really grow.
That's a great depiction of the level of understanding that it takes in that ignition and holding process, which is the second operational phase of a prescribed burning after the planning and evaluation is done. That whole phase is filled with nuance and filled with many decisions taking place throughout the day based on what the weather's doing. And the weather is just this thing that every hour on the hour, somebody's over the radio telling you what the weather is. And we designate a person during that process about keeping track of the weather. And that shows that burn boss knew exactly that maybe the humidity was a little bit higher, or the winds weren't moving quite as fast during that time of the day. And he understood that and found a good teachable moment in that. So I like that. I like having those teachable moments where it's safe and nobody's going to be any worse for wear, but you learn a lesson. Take a little bit of humble pie, I guess.
I guarantee you never did that again. Never ripped a black line off 20 feet off your holding line. So.
Well, see, and I never would have thought of that, to demonstrate to somebody what not to do, or let them figure it out on their own, I guess.
Oh, I think all of us learned that lesson that day as well. It wasn't just that one line boss. Yeah,
so the ignition and holding is this whole process of doing small... Ignition can look in a lot of different scenarios. It can look differently. It can be one little... You walk 15 feet, you drop a dot of fire on the ground, and then you walk another 15 feet, you drop a dot on the ground. Sometimes it can be ripping down the side of a road and lighting one solid stream of fire. So we can talk about that a little bit more, but I wanted to go into what you had mentioned about failures. They're always inevitable in anything we do in life, really. But how is a failure, or maybe an apparent failure, not even necessarily fire related, how is something like that set you up later in life for success?
I was trying to think of this, I've got a fire one, but let me know if it's not relevant at all, but I think it kind of is. So
sure, of course.
So I don't, it's weird, like some people wouldn't classify this as a failure, but I would. So, so there's different ways of conducting ignition. So there's ground ignition, and then there's aerial ignition, and you've got a couple different ways of applying aerial ignition, and a lot of it's traditionally done with helicopters, and they've got this really cool stuff now where you can actually do ignition with drones, like the drone that you would use to go and film a vacation.
I want one of those. Yeah, they're very expensive.
Super expensive. Yeah, it is. It is not within my reach in this moment, but and so it's really neat, kind of what you can do. It's in some ways safer because you are not putting people into a landscape that might be very overgrown or very viney or a lot of palmetto, things where people could get lost or tangled up or entrapped. And so a lot of times, aerial ignition is sometimes a good option to keep your crew safe and also, get a lot of work done, because you can do a lot of acreage. And, we're talking, some helicopters won't do ignition on anything under 600 acres because when they do their turn, especially in those old Huey helicopters that Florida Forest uses, you can just, as they make the turn, you can just kind of feel gravity and just feel your stomach rising up into your throat. And
I was just about to say, I wouldn't be able to do that. I get motion sick bad.
Yeah. It's I took a Dramamine on my first one just as a precaution, because it's a ride. But so they don't, some helicopter pilots and some helicopters are a little bit more nimble and they can do smaller burns. But what I've dealt with have been bigger helicopters that need larger acreage to be able to safely operate. And so That ground ignition, this was a property that I did not manage full time. This was something that was within my agency purview, but I did not know the property very well until we saw a need that it needed to be burned, and there was really no one else who wanted to take that on necessarily. I wouldn't say that had the time and ability to take that on. I misspoke, but yeah, so really no one to be able to have the time and the ability to take on burning this property.
So
and,
you were bossing this burn, is that right?
well, I was going to. This is the failure portion. So
Spoiler alert.
yeah, spoiler alert. Yeah. So
Right.
I spent days because it wasn't, once again, not my it was in my agency, but not my property. So I needed to go up there and I needed to learn the roads. You can look at a map, but you need to get eyes on what the fuel looks like. You need to, drought conditions. You need to look at, hey, they tell me I can get a certain equipment down here, but can I? And so I spent days and days. I mean, this was an hour and 20 minutes away from my home park that I was working at. And we spent days going up there and just looking at it. Wrote the prescription, the plan to move forward that, basically gives you your objectives and, spelled all of that out. Got the helicopter lined up. They flew in from, across the state, and it was a multi-agency burn at that point, and I had a bunch of people because it was a pretty complex unit that was going to be over 1,000 acres, and I ended up waking up that the day before. I looked at the weather and I said, all right, it's a little spicy, but I think it looks good. I think we can do this, because a lot of this was
Spicy. Sorry to stop you. Spicy meaning?
So it was a higher dispersion, which is an indicator for potential long-range spotting, but also volatile fire behavior. A lot of people actually don't use dispersion out west. They use the Haynes index, but for us in the southeast, we use dispersion to kind of look at those factors on fires. And it was pretty gusty winds, and so that night I spent the night up there. I camped, and then you get up in the morning and you immediately just start looking at the weather. You start getting everything lined out, and looked at the morning weather, and at this point, people were committed. The helicopter had flown into town the night before, and I looked at that weather, and I was hesitant, and then I called a couple people, and I was actually getting pushed to do the burn.
There was pressure.
Yeah.
There's so much pressure.
Yeah, especially when
you get everybody, even if anybody's standing there or calling you, wanting to.
Yeah.
Come on, let's do this. We're here. We're ready to go.
Because I was pulling people from all over, all over, and I was like, can I do it? And I called the pilot before he took off from where he was down south of the unit, and I said, hey man, how are you feeling about this? And he's like, I don't know about that. If we got to do it, we got to do it. And I just, at that point, it became, is the operation worth this? So, what am I trying to achieve with this? And is it worth the risk? And especially because for us, like burning in Florida, I mean, we have very good laws that protect prescribed fire practitioners, luckily. But I mean, ultimately not just the liability, but that responsibility as a leader comes down to you making that decision is kind of risk management, but also just, it's a little bit of gut. You do it enough, and you a lot of it is status quo. You're used to, you've seen enough, and you can kind of anticipate what might happen. But then sometimes your gut just twists up on you, and sometimes you push through it, but this one I did not. So that's why I consider it a failure, because I did not end up pulling that permit that day, and I had to call a bunch of people, turn the helicopter around, and And ultimately, I did not accomplish that burn. They ended up burning it with a couple ground burns a couple years later, and it was fine. You know, everything worked out. And so and I don't know if that was necessarily a failure, but it felt like that at the time. You know, like a couple years later, now looking back on it, you know, that morning I just felt lower than anything, and. You know, people were like, no, Tracey, it was a good decision. You're the one who's responsible for it. But, you know, it was just, it was very discouraging to me. It took me a little bit to come back from that. And really kind of what that taught me is more confidence to be able to say no and to be able to say, hey, it's not worth it today. You know, we'll get it another day. And that's hard. You know, like what you just said is like everyone's like looking at you, you know, but since then I've called off burns morning of, and I'm just like, sorry, y'all, that's just part of the game. And everyone understands that. Like, that's the thing is like, I felt like it was a failure, but everyone understands that that's just part of prescribed fire. You get the weather, you're anticipating it, but that's just part of the game is to, you know, to call things off. So.
Great story. I think you're right about that. It sounds in my mind like it later, in retrospect, it is a success because you had the wherewithal to listen to your gut. Maybe things would have went great, but there was that chance. That's
not the right thing to say, Cully.
Well, but maybe things would have went great, but more than likely, what you're telling me, it would have been a problem.
Yeah.
And we can't operate on maybes.
Yeah.
I had a great mentor of mine tell me, this guy, I hope to have him on the show soon. He says, we now live in a world where we can no longer skate by on the planning process. It's time to put the roller skates away. And by that, he meant that there's the planning process in doing what you're talking about. Back in the old days, and I say the old days meaning, you know, earlier times in the evolution of our understanding of prescribed fire, there would have been some pressure there, and things may have gone. You might have gotten pressured into it, but now we understand so much about it, and the science and management are working so well hand in hand now that folks like you who have a very thorough understanding of fire and also are in tune with what their gut is telling them, you have the wherewithal to say no, and I think that's a great success. I really like that story. So I think that's all we have for our episode tonight, folks. Thank you for joining us, Tracey. We really appreciate you, and I'm very thankful that you helped us learn from some of your experiences. It's been real, it's been fun, and it's also been real fun letting you lead us in this experience as we take another step beyond the fire.